Upon learning of her mother's disappearance, Samantha's emotions spiral out of control. Samuel tries to comfort her, but Samantha refuses to accept the truth. She insists that Samuel is lying, while he insists that she must stay calm. Will they be able to find Samantha's mother? Is James really the culprit behind this? How will Samantha confront this situation? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 31. I don't need a wheelchair. I quickly reciprocated Samuel's smile. I couldn't help it. In that moment, a weight I'd been carrying for years was finally taken away. It was liberating. It was freeing. It made it seem as if everything would eventually be okay. They really mean a lot to you, don't they? Samuel suddenly questioned. I turned again to look at him. I'd been staring at the wall for the past few minutes, relishing in my small reprieve from reality. They're all I have. They're everything, I answered simply. I understand. He gave me a small grin, though it was laced with an emotion other than joy. I tried to catch it, but as soon as it came, it was gone. I furrowed my eyebrows, speaking before I knew what I was saying. What about you? What about me? He looked at me with curiosity and amusement. I bit my lip. Well, I mean, do you have a family? Samuel was surprised at my sudden forwardness, and to be frank, so was I. The question and my curiosity slipped out before I could stop them. My initial instinct was to retract my question and apologize, but I resisted the urge, letting the question linger heavy in the air. Emotions ran across Samuel's face, disappearing the minute they surfaced. He was quiet for a few moments, deep in thought and contemplating something weighing heavy on his mind. He stole a glance my way every few seconds, as if reassuring himself I was still there. When he finally did answer, his face was devoid of any emotion. The pack is my family. Oh, I breathed. Why the sudden interest? He gave me a sideways glance. I let out a long sigh. I don't know. I was just curious. He laughed once. The pack is all I have, he told me, though his voice was slightly strained. Riley's always been there for me, and I hope I can always be there for him in the pack. At Riley's name, thoughts, memories, and threats flashed through my mind. My mood was instantly dampened. I didn't let that reach my face but gave Samuel a small smile. That's nice. I'm glad you have him. Samuel raised one eyebrow at me. I broke his gaze and stared once more at the wall. Just as he was about to say something else, there was a small and timid knock on the door. We both whipped our gazes to it, Samuel tensing slightly. After the third knock sounded, the light wooden door began to slowly open. A woman peeked her head through, glancing at Samuel as she did. He nodded once, and that was enough for her to fully enter the room. When she was fully in view, I was able to recognize her as the woman from before who helped in sedating me. It was her voice that ultimately lulled me into what seemed to be a never-ending sleep. She spoke softly as she walked slowly forward. How are you feeling today? Her gaze darted between Samuel and me. Tired, I trailed off, suspicious of her intentions. Under no circumstances would I be sedated again. That's to be expected. She smiled sweetly, tucking away a piece of blonde hair into her ponytail. It was then I realized the bags under her eyes and the permanent face of exhaustion she seemed to brand. She was older than me, probably middle-aged, with a petite frame that was heavily weighed down. The woman continued her way across the room and came to stand on the opposite side of the bed of Samuel. She looked over the monitors, writing a few things down here and there. No one in the room breathed, and the sound of silence was deafening. How is your pain? She suddenly questioned, not looking up from what she was writing. I paused, realizing it was practically non-existent. Great, actually. She smiled again, nodding to herself. We'd like to take a look at your stitches and change your dressings before we move forward with anything else. You're not going to sedate me again, are you? The woman laughed lightly, and I saw a small smile creep across Samuel's face. No, she clarified, we're not. I nodded and smiled back at the woman, relief flooding me. Though I wasn't intent on being sedated, I doubted I could have fought them off. I'm going to grab some supplies and I will be right back. The woman nodded to us before exiting the room. Samuel stood up from the bed, stretching his arms high above him. He sighed heavily as he moved away from me, retreating to the armchair in the corner of the room. You don't have to stay, I told him, watching the door for the nurses to come back in. He shrugged. I'm not leaving. The next hour was a blur. The woman brought in 2 other nurses to assist her, and they all worked quietly and quickly. As they peeled back bandages and rubbed cream around my wound, the pain started creeping in once more. I promptly ignored it, knowing additional pain medicine would only add to my current state of exhaustion. So I gritted my teeth and kept my face impassive. As they worked, they explained to me what they were doing and how my healing was progressing, but I didn't really pay attention. Most of their words were foreign anyway. All I could gather was that it would take longer than preferable before I was fully functioning again. Though that knowledge was frustrating, it didn't surprise me. Traversing through the woods with 2 species out to kill you wasn't exactly a walk in the park. I realized too that the longer I stayed in the hospital, the longer I could postpone being locked away. Eventually, the nurses left. After they were gone, my wounds were cleaned, and various foods were forced down my throat. I was finally left on my own. Samuel, of course, stayed with me, but it was hard to pay him any attention. I leaned back on my bed once more, closing my eyes and drifting in and out of consciousness. Now that I wasn't moving, my pain was once again non-existent and I was left with a comfortable numbness. A calming silence filled each and every crack in the room, only adding to my relief. Samuel didn't attempt to speak to me but allowed me solace in my small reprieve. The remainder of the day proceeded like that. Easy silence with countless naps. The blonde woman would come in every few hours to check on me, but that was the only anomaly in an uneventful day. When the clock read well into the evening, I voiced a thought that had been lingering in my mind. "Can I see Will?" I questioned Samuel, lifting myself to face him. He was currently sitting in his chair, though now it was pulled obnoxiously close to my bed. Between that and the medical equipment there wasn't much room. Samuel didn't seem to mind though, and he wasn't planning on moving his chair back anytime soon. Samuel opened one of his eyes. His arms were folded across his chest and he was leaning back, his head falling against the back of the chair. To anyone else it would have looked like he was sleeping. I, however, knew he never slept unless I did. I asked if I could see Will. I repeated in an even tone. My hands fidgeted with the blanket resting on my waist. I knew that he'd agreed to let me see my brother previously, but that was before I had a slight mental breakdown and had to be sedated. Samuel shifted his weight, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I don't have anything against that." He then paused, mulling over his thoughts. My heart sank, recognizing the uncertain expression he now wore. "But I want to check with the doctors." I let out a heavy breath and tried to resist rolling my eyes. "I just want to go sit with him. I'm not running across town or anything. I know. I just don't want to take any chances." He gave me a pointed look. "You were shot, Samantha. So you keep reminding me," I grumbled. Samuel laughed and rose from his chair, pushing it back. He then stepped towards the door, leaving it half open as he called to the nearest nurse on duty. He lingered just outside of my earshot, speaking with whoever it was in a low tone. I tried desperately to hear what they were saying, but he made sure that was impossible. Soon enough, he eventually came back through the door and walked over to me. I was surprised, however, to see someone trailing closely behind him. When I saw what they carted, it was impossible to hold back a scoff. "A wheelchair? Really?" Samuel shrugged, turning around and dismissing the nurse while grabbing the black chair. He placed it directly next to my bed so that I could easily maneuver onto it if needed. When it was locked in place, his hand reached out towards me, gesturing for me to take my place in the horrifying chair. I vehemently shook my head. "I don't need a wheelchair. I figured you'd say that." Samuel looked as if he wanted to be annoyed, but a smile tugged at his lips. "The nurses said that you shouldn't be moving around a lot. It could tear your stitches. Plus, you have a lot of medicine running through you. I'm not exactly sure I trust you to walk on your own." "I'm fine," I insisted, narrowing my eyes. "And I'm not sitting in that thing." "What, you don't trust me?" Samuel pouted. I rolled my eyes at his childish gesture. "Pouting does not look good on you, wolf boy." He barked a laugh. "I'm wolf boy again. We're back to that." "We never left," I grumbled, folding my arms across my chest. Samuel continued laughing, shaking his head. "Look," he paused, moving closer to me and placing a large hand on my folded arms. "I'm ready to take you to see your brother, but my one condition is the chair." "It's not that bad, really." I looked at it warily, treating it more as a snake than a simple piece of furniture. Having Samuel wheel me around the hospital was the last thing I desired, but on the other hand, I desperately wanted to see Will. I hadn't heard anything about him since I left, and I wasn't sure what state he was in. I'd really be fine to walk. I tried one last time, pushing my chances and playing on Samuel's sympathies. He sighed. And I'd really be fine to let you stay in bed all day. I glared at him. When I knew he wasn't going to budge, I let out a frustrated breath and the expression melted away. Fine. He smiled, moving quickly to the side to allow me full access to the chair. I braced my muscles, swinging my legs over the edge of my bed. Though I tried to do so gracefully and without pain, it didn't go according to plan. I got tangled in blankets and twisted my hips a bit too much, causing a sharp burning to shoot up my side. My breathing hitched in my throat as I held back a gasp, waiting for it to subside. Of course, Samuel was next to me in an instant, holding my hand tightly. I'm fine, I quickly told him, seeing the look of concern cross his features. I just moved a bit too quickly. Samuel nodded silently and started untangling the blankets from around my legs, causing me to shiver from the sudden exposure. Not a moment later was he helping me off the bed to sit in the uncomfortable chair, gracefully and with minimal effort. When I was situated, he placed an extra blanket in my lap. I quickly tucked it around my legs while Samuel grabbed whatever machine I was connected to and pulled it beside the chair. When everything was settled, he unlocked the wheels and began carting me out of the room and across the hospital floors. It was humiliating. I avoided the glances from the hospital workers, though I knew they didn't linger on me for long. From this alone, I knew most of the workers had to be human. They skirted far around the edges of Samuel and me, some even turning the opposite direction when they saw us coming their way. Samuel didn't seem to notice this, nor did he seem to mind. Not soon enough were we finally in a hallway I recognized. From here, I knew the exact room Will was resting in. Somehow Samuel knew this too, as he brought me right outside the correct door. When he reached forward to turn the handle, my heart started racing with anxiety. For all I knew, Will could be on the brink of death and there would be nothing I could do about it. In my current state, there was no way I could continue to provide for his treatment. When the door opened and Samuel wheeled me inside, I took in a sharp breath. The scene before me was enough to send my mind into a frenzy. Will was still laying in a hospital bed in the center of the room. However, that was the only similarity to the room I'd been in so many times before today. This room used to hold the rejected equipment, the overused bed, and monitors that seemed as if they were ready to fall apart. Those were the only things we could afford and the only things James would allow. Now, Will was laying in a bed that seemed twice the size of any normal hospital bed. Brand new equipment lined the wall behind him and fresh, up-to-date X-rays littered the opposite. For a fleeting moment I thought we were in the wrong place. Samuel had paused as soon as we stepped foot in the room, allowing time for me to adjust. I took countless deep breaths, my hand finding its way to my heart while my eyes scanned everything over again and again. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. What happened? I let out a whisper. Samuel didn't explain but pushed me forward until I was sitting next to Will. I talked with his doctor. He spoke slowly, dancing around my earlier question. She said his surgery went well and he's slowly improving. For the first time, I allowed my eyes to wholly rest on my brother. Compared to the last time I saw him, he looked almost like a different person. His legs were no longer bandaged and elevated, but resting underneath mounds of knitted blankets. The bruises were long gone, leaving his normally rough and dry skin spotless. Though wires were still attached to multiple parts of his body, there were much less than last time. When I looked at him, I could almost imagine he was only sleeping and would wake with a brush of my hand. Tears welled in my eyes, though they weren't tears of sadness. I never thought my brother would recover from what James did to him, but here I was, staring at the evidence of just that. Though he was still asleep and there were parts of his body that still needed healing, it was a far cry from being on the verge of death. It seemed almost a miracle that he'd improved this much in the short amount of time since I last saw him. How? I asked, shaking my head. Samuel moved from behind me to stand at my side. He looked at Will with interest. The doctors have been working hard on him. Apparently, I trailed off, my eyes scanning the new equipment behind Will. Where did all of this come from? Where did all of what come from? I gestured to the walls. All of it. I can't afford any of it. Samuel shrugged, avoiding my gaze. His peculiar behavior was slowly starting to make sense, and I stared at him in disbelief. It was you. I questioned, but it was more of a statement. When Samuel shrugged again, I grabbed his arm in attention. My eyes bore into his own, demanding an answer. I might have called the hospital, he ultimately sighed. My hand released his arm and absently came back to rest in my lap. I furrowed my brows, searching my mind for a reason as to why Samuel was suddenly acting this way. Up to this point, nothing I wanted or cared about mattered. Now, suddenly, Samuel was straining his neck to take care of those I loved. I was beyond grateful knowing these things were no longer a constant concern, but his actions were perplexing. The minute I thought I had Samuel pinned down, he did something to defy my expectations. Why are you doing this? I asked him softly. Samuel turned my chair to face him as he crouched down to my level. We were staring at each other face to face when he spoke. Because I want you to be happy. I refused to look at him, knowing if I did I would fall into what I always thought was false sympathy. Confusion swam thick in my mind and I needed all of my senses in order to try and understand it. That didn't seem to matter before, I eventually told him. He sighed, resting his hands on mine in my lap. It's always mattered. Samuel must have noticed something lingering on my face because he softly continued. I know I've messed up, Samantha. Trust me, I know. He ran a hand through his dark hair. I'm just trying to fix this. His words swam slowly through my mind, tumbling over one another until I couldn't analyze them any longer. From the tone of his voice and the desperation on his face, I knew he was telling the truth. However, that terrified me. Can I have a minute? I looked at Samuel briefly before flicking my gaze to remain on Will. I needed time to process what Samuel was telling me, and I couldn't do that with him kneeling in front of me. He hesitated, searching my features. Of course. His tone was defeated and I didn't have to look at him to see the strain etched into his features. I didn't watch him walk out of the room, but I listened for the click of the door. Only when I knew he was gone did I allow my composure to falter. I bent forward, resting my head in my hands. I didn't cry though, as I knew Samuel would be back the moment he heard a tear fall. Instead, I breathed heavily and curled into myself as much as the stitches on my side would allow. Chapter 32. What a pleasant surprise. I held myself for a few fleeting moments, attempting to gather my thoughts into something I could comprehend. When it didn't work, I groaned and threw my head back, staring at my brother. I could seriously use you right now, Will. His blank features remained the same, unaffected by my plea. I had grown to expect this though, so it didn't thwart me. Weeks of not having him around trained me to expect silence. I learned to fill it though, my one-sided conversations helping cut through the void left behind. I started to speak again but quickly stopped myself, remembering Samuel. Knowing him, he would be waiting just outside the door, listening to every word that left my mouth. This was beyond frustrating, considering the very thing I wanted to speak to Will about was the dog himself. My fingers found their way to my temples. A headache was coming on, but I knew it wasn't from my injuries. Samuel's actions were sending my body into overdrive. If I knew what to expect from him, I could prepare for and easily handle it. But with him switching back and forth from controlling my life to taking care of my problems and family, I couldn't keep up. I had so many questions and so many conflicting emotions that I didn't know what to do with them. On the one hand, I knew Samuel's actions were sincere. I could tell that much. With Samuel, whatever he was feeling was usually plastered on his face. Unless he was careful, I was able to read his every emotion. As far as I could tell, his intentions were genuine. The things he'd done for me since we'd been back home were what one might expect from someone trying to show they care. On the other hand, everything I'd ever been through pointed to werewolves being incapable of caring. They took over the world and all the creatures in it to gain power and control. They slaughtered anything that could breathe, tore apart families, and built a world revolving around their needs and their needs alone. Nothing and no one else mattered. They were ruthless, cold-hearted, and controlling. But lately Samuel hadn't been any of those things. There were times that he terrified me and times that I saw the animal inside of him, but on the surface it seemed as though there was something more than an animalistic need to dominate. After all, there was no gain from him taking care of me or my family. His actions held no profit for himself. I shook my head, trying again to clear it. It was a near impossible task. Letting my troubles slip away took a few minutes, and only when I looked at my brother did the stress finally melt off of me. "You're looking a lot better," I whispered to him, bringing my hand to his arm. "You sure have missed a lot." I was silent for a while, watching and listening to his even breaths. The urge to tell him everything that happened was growing. Because of this, I opened and closed my mouth multiple times, searching for anything I could say that would relieve my stress. "I got out, you know. I made it." I spoke so softly I could barely hear myself. When I opened my mouth again, the words came as easily as a breath of fresh air. "I made it pretty far, actually. It was wonderful, Will. Everything was so green. For a while it was only me out there." I smiled to myself, but it was quickly wiped away. I would have made it all the way too, but you know me. I'm always screwing things up. My lungs let out all the air they'd been holding, but that somehow only made me feel heavier. I glanced at the door. Knowing who lurked beyond it was part of the reason. "I'm back now for good," I spoke again, my voice lowering considerably. It was back to nothing more than a faint whisper. "We'll all be safe, and that's what matters. Nothing else." Everything from before, I trailed off, thinking of the plans Will and I shared for our family's escape. It doesn't matter. And in that moment I realized how true my statement was. I would never risk their lives for anything. As long as Will and my mother were safe, everything would be fine. I knew the only way I could ensure their safety was by falling into Samuel's arms and not questioning his intentions. His actions, no matter how confusing, didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was Riley's promise that my family would receive no harm, as long as I made Samuel happy. I stayed in Will's room mulling over my thoughts for what felt like hours. Samuel never came inside and never interrupted us. Eventually, though, I knew it had to end. This thought rang true when a knock sounded at the door and a familiar face came walking through. "Dr. Gates," I perked up, surprise lacing my tone. "Samantha," she nodded my way and smiled. It seemed a foreign gesture for her, but it also seemed to be sincere. What a pleasant surprise. I promptly returned her smile. When I saw Samuel walk into the room behind Dr. Gates, I laughed lightly. I'm sure it wasn't that big of a surprise. Her gaze darted behind her, but she didn't acknowledge Samuel's presence. Instead, she turned her back and came to stand next to my chair, both of our gazes turning to Will. "He seems like he's doing better," I hesitantly spoke. "Much better than previously. His swelling has gone down, brain activity seems to be normal, and the internal injuries are healing nicely. We're expecting him to wake soon." "Really?" I turned to face her. She nodded firmly, eyeing the monitors next to Will's bed. "Thanks to his new accommodations, his healing has improved greatly." Samuel suddenly spoke from the doorway, interrupting us. "We should be getting back." I turned my head to glance at him, but Dr. Gates kept her gaze forward, her face hardening. At her actions, my heart leaped and eyes widened considerably. What she was doing was considered blatant disrespect, and from the scowl slowly creeping onto her face, I was positive she meant it. Panic started coursing through my veins, but when I turned to Samuel, he only had eyes for me. He didn't comment on her behavior, nor did he glance her way. He only watched me carefully, holding out one of his hands. I tried to keep my composure and ignore Dr. Gates' actions as my hands reached down to direct the wheels toward Samuel. When I got past her and Samuel took my chair, I offered her a quiet, "Thank you." Dr. Gates opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything I was wheeled out of the room. The halls were quiet as Samuel pushed me the short distance back to my room. The only noise was his footsteps rhythmically echoing off the floor. It was well into the evening, much later than I initially thought, and it seemed as if most of the workers had gone home for the night. "Thank you," I eventually told him, my soft voice blanketing around us. Samuel's step faltered slightly. "You don't have to thank me for seeing your family, Samantha." I raised my eyebrows, my comment slipping out before I could stop it. "Well, you could have refused and just locked me in that room." "It's not my place to keep you from your family," he scoffed. The smallest whisper of bitterness laced his tone. My mouth opened to respond, but no words came out. The abrupt sharpness of his voice left me speechless and baffled. I thought Samuel would relish in the fact I was thanking him, but it seemed it did the exact opposite. "Sorry," I muttered, not sure how else to respond. We came to a pause outside my door. Instead of Samuel leading us inside, He stopped and turned my chair to face him. He crouched down to my level and rested one hand on my knee, the other on the back of his neck. Don't be sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for. I almost apologized again, but I caught myself and gave him a small nod, biting the inside of my lips. He gave me a short smile and stood up, pushing me the rest of the way into my room. Getting into my bed was much more difficult than getting out. True to Samuel's suspicions, the minute I tried standing on my own, I fell. He was there to catch me, of course, but didn't let me try standing again. Instead, he easily picked me up and placed me on the mattress, tucking the blankets around me as I settled in. When he was satisfied with my state, Samuel pulled the armchair next to my bed once again. I tried not to stare as he shifted awkwardly in the chair, moving his limbs this way and that. It was honestly much too small for him, and he was having a hard time making himself comfortable enough to lie back. In the end, he settled to sprawl his legs underneath my bed and fold his arms across his chest, leaning his head on his shoulder. I smiled tentatively, noticing the clear discomfort etched into his expression. You really should find a bed or something. He sighed, opening one of his eyes to meet my own. You really shouldn't worry about it. My response was cut off by a pounding noise right outside my door. Samuel shot out of his chair, throwing it back against the wall and sending countless machines with it. He jumped in front of me as the door was thrown open and white light came flooding in from the hallway. A figure emerged from that light, gallivanting into the room like nothing had happened. Riley, Samuel abruptly called out, clear annoyance seething from his voice. You scared the hell out of me. Riley's laugh sounded through the room and suddenly, the bedroom light was turned on. It blinded me for just a moment, which was enough for Riley to close the distance to my bed. He stood at the foot, staring at me and Samuel, holding his arms out. What? You aren't happy to see me? Samuel huffed, turning to grab the chair and pick the equipment up from off the floor. What do you want? I was surprised at the terse tone he'd adopted, but I didn't comment. I just wanted to come and see my favorite patient, he spoke innocently, eyes landing on me. I avoided his gaze, knowing his red orbs would send my heart racing. How are you, Samantha? Fine, I whispered. Samuel spoke over me, though the irritation was leaving his voice. We're tired, Riley. Shouldn't you be back at the house? Riley shrugged, placing his hands on the bottom of my bed. I've got Bray doing the rest of everything. I was bored. Bray. Samuel paused, eyeing Riley. Oh, calm down. It's nothing important. Samuel relaxed and fell into the chair once more. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and one arm on the side of my bed. Subconsciously, I folded my legs and curled my arms into my body, making myself as small as possible. I see the doctors fixed you up quite nicely, Riley drawled on, patting the frame of my bed. I nodded, keeping my gaze trained on the white blanket beneath me. Where this hospital room was once spacious, it suddenly seemed too small to even breathe. Riley laughed suddenly. Cat got your tongue. Or was it a dog this time? Riley, Samuel half growled. What? I'm just trying to have a conversation. Samuel shook his head, exasperated. You're goading her. Me. Riley scoffed. No, Eden would never let me do that. I'm being a perfect gentleman. Samuel let out a heavy sigh, glancing carefully at me. While I was watching the two of them from my peripheral, I hadn't moved my gaze from my lap. I thought if I was careful with my actions and lucky enough, Riley would take Samuel and then I could rest without either of their presences. Why are you here? Samuel asked tiredly. I told you. I wanted to see my favorite patient. Samuel gave Riley an abrupt look of discontent, at which Riley laughed. Always straight to the point, isn't he, Samantha? Again I nodded. Riley smiled even larger at this but finally decided to give his full attention to Samuel. The other reason I came here was to talk to you. Since you so selflessly haven't shifted the past few days, I came to relieve you of your babysitting duties. You need to go for a run or something. Maybe go clean out your apartment. We both know you're a pig at heart. Samuel's eyes darted to me and I tried not to stiffen. I knew what Riley was insinuating. I'm perfectly fine, Riley, Samuel started, and I can send someone to clean the apartment. Maybe so, but you don't want them going through your personal belongings, do you? It's been a while since you've been there. I'm sure there are some things that need to be put away. Riley emphasized. Samuel stilled. then cursed under his breath. I can go later, he spoke to Riley while looking at me. I caught his gaze for a moment, noticing the stress and conflict binding his eyes. Nonsense. Why put off until tomorrow what you can do right now? Samuel rolled his eyes, giving Riley a look. Really? You're really telling me that? He laughed lightly. I never was one to follow my own advice, we both know that. He paused, giving Samuel time to retort. When he was quiet, Riley continued on, smiling. Now go on. Samantha and I will be perfectly fine here, won't we? The room seemed to hold its breath as it awaited my response. In that split second, I realized I had two options. I could beg for Samuel to stay, upsetting Riley and his agenda, or I could convince Samuel I wasn't terrified to be alone with the alpha. Both were unsettling and impossible choices. But in the end, it wasn't Samuel that had my family's lives on a string. I'll be fine, I told Samuel softly. Go take care of yourself. Samuel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His expression held deep conflict on, and I knew that whatever was in his apartment must have been important. He wouldn't willingly leave for anything trivial. Eventually, Samuel sighed and slowly rose from his chair. Just give me an hour. I gave him a small smile before landing my gaze back on my lap. Riley came around to sit in Samuel's chair while urging him towards the door. Take all the time you need. Chapter 33. Go on, ask me. Samuel begrudgingly started leaving the room, repeating over and over again that he'd be back soon. He wasn't keen on leaving, and multiple times he tried to make an excuse to stay. However, because he was so distracted, his excuses were weak and easily dismissed by Riley. I stayed impassive while Riley shoved Samuel along, pushing him through the door. When he was finally out of the room, down the hall, and out of earshot, Riley turned to me. I expected his face to darken and the threats to ensue, but he kept his cheerful demeanor. I doubt he'll even be an hour, Riley mused. Honestly, I'm surprised he left in the first place. I thought it'd take a lot more than that. I held my breath and nodded. It seemed that was all I was capable of. Riley laughed. You don't need to worry, I'm not going to kill you. It'd be too messy. Plus, Samuel would never forgive me. I nodded again, my suddenly clammy hands twisting the blanket in my lap. Riley waited for me to say something else, and while the silence stretched, my heart rate climbed. 1,000 questions ran through my mind, but I didn't let them go any further than that. If I misspoke and asked something wrong, Riley could easily use it against me. I wasn't going to give him any reason to go after my family. With Will so close, there would be nothing I could do if Riley wanted to prove a point. When he saw I wasn't going to verbally respond, Riley sighed, exasperated. Seriously, just calm down, will you? You're making me on edge. His legs started twitching as he came to sit in what used to be Samuel's chair. I tried to do as I was told, letting out small breaths and focusing on soothing my mind. Why are you here? I eventually managed. Well, he shifted his weight forward, leaning towards my bed. I wanted to see how my favorite couple is getting along. We're doing fine. My voice was small. Maybe so, but I heard there was an incident of sorts. Riley prodded. Confusion swam in my expression as I fought through the memories of the hospital. At no point had I deliberately disrespected or upset Samuel. Most of my time here had been spent asleep or with my brother. For these reasons, I couldn't figure out what he was referring to, nor how he knew anything had happened. As far as I was aware, Samuel hadn't been in contact with Riley. Then again, I didn't know much. When Riley saw my expression, he continued, rolling his eyes dramatically. Come on, Samantha. You thought I wouldn't hear about your so-called panic attack. Who do you think these people work for? I shook my head fervently, finally understanding. I started to explain, but he cut me off. Don't care. I'll hear the correct story from Samuel, and I don't need your excuses. My mouth stayed hanging half open. What do you want, then? Well, firstly, let's make sure we don't have another one of those episodes. Sound good? I nodded and he smiled. We need to talk about this plan with Samuel. You'll be getting out of the hospital soon and real life is going to start. Real life for Samuel means that he has responsibilities with the pack. Responsibilities that his mate is supposed to help him with. But since you're human, it complicates things. He groaned. You really do make life quite difficult. If you were a wolf, we wouldn't have to deal with any of this. Sorry, I muttered, trying to keep the bitterness out of my tone. If they were human, I wouldn't have to deal with any of this either. Riley waved his hand dismissively. It's no matter. Your humanity won't be a problem for much longer. I took a deep breath, trying to relax and ignore his last comment. What am I supposed to do then? I glanced at Riley briefly. He wasn't staring at me but looking around the room, bored. As I regarded his nonchalant attitude, a spark of annoyance licked at my heart. While I was fighting to keep myself together, he was acting as if there wasn't a care in the world. Whatever Samuel asks you to, I scoffed, unable to hold it back. I meant for my next word to only sound in my head, but it came out of my mouth, too late for me to stop it. Obviously. Riley's eyes darted to mine immediately, glowing red with a sudden fire. Well, if you know so much, then why don't you explain to me how this works? I closed my eyes, cursing myself. The one goal I had was to not piss Riley off, yet here I was doing just that. I could feel his gaze burning into me, but I pressed my lips tightly together, fearful that anything I said would only anger him further. This is exactly why I could never let my guard down. This is why it was better to stay quiet. No answer, he demanded. I bowed my head and slumped my shoulders, showing him in every way possible he'd won this small fight. However, he wasn't done with me. That's what I thought. You don't have an answer, you don't know anything, he told me matter-of-factly. The only reason you're even still alive is because of Samuel. You owe your life to him, no matter how pathetic of a life it may be. Do you understand that? Yes, I whispered. Good. Do you also understand that I could kill your brother in a heartbeat, and no one would notice or question it? That I could put your mother on trial for the disappearance of her mate? That if I were really dedicated, I could find that packless mutt and bring him back? How would your dear family fare then? My heart stopped along with my world. His threats cut deeper and deeper into an already raw wound. I desperately tried to fix my mistake, keeping my head bowed and my full attention on his rising temper. I'm sorry, do you understand? He reiterated, ignoring my groveling. My voice couldn't have been softer. Yes. Wonderful. Then the job shouldn't be too hard, even for you. He immediately calmed down, leaning back in his chair and resting his arms behind his head, mumbling something I couldn't hear. I stayed silent, despite the fact my mind was going wild. It wasn't in my nature to bend over and allow someone to speak to me like Riley did, but I had no choice. Just like I had no choice when James did it. If I were to argue, I wouldn't be the ones facing the consequences. Those were reserved for my family. That was reason enough to stay withdrawn and endure their demeaning words. Anyway, like I was saying, Riley stopped his mumblings and focused on me once more. I refused to let this humanity thing get in the way for much longer. I understand, but we will fix this. It's going to take time, but I have a plan. Riley paused, his voice growing excited. Go on, ask me what it is. I held back a sigh. What is the plan? You must ask Samuel to change you. I went deathly still, searching desperately for a way to postpone this new idea of his. Won't he change me anyway? I'm not sure anymore, Riley hummed. He is a stickler for the rules, but he also doesn't want to hurt you. After your little stunt, I'm sure he's going to do whatever it takes to gain your approval, and not make you want to run again. He laughed, not that you could. My mouth opened to respond, but I couldn't find the correct words. 1,000 different questions, arguments, and pleas threatened to spill all at once. Suddenly, I was sure that if I uttered even a syllable, my thoughts would come out uncontrollably, and Riley would be at my throat. Riley noticed my inner struggle. Now I know what you're thinking, he took on a high-pitched voice. He'll never believe me, the change will kill me. Being human isn't a bad thing. I raised an eyebrow at his horrific impression, noting that he only gathered half of what I was actually thinking. Riley, however, laughed at himself. Well, should anyone ask, I have answers to all three of those concerns. Answers for yourself and Samuel. Now go on, ask me what they are. He looked at me expectantly, eyes wild and glowing red. I checked my words before I hesitantly spoke, his last question intriguing me most. What's your answer to my humanity not being a bad thing? Riley raised his eyebrows and clapped his hands together. Well, you've come to realize who the real enemy is, have you not? Samuel told me how those humans you trusted turned on you. What a shame. It was a real eye-opening experience for you, though. What are you saying? I slowly prodded. He scoffed. It's simple. You now believe that humans can't be trusted. A belief I wholeheartedly agree with, mind you. They're terribly unloyal and dishonest creatures, only looking out for themselves. He shuddered dramatically before continuing his thought. Once you realize this, and once Samuel gave you such a shining example, it was easy to decide to become something better and make the change. Understand? I subconsciously nodded, trying to keep up. He was practically spelling out the thoughts and feelings I should be having. If I could ingrain those into my mind, Samuel would be happy, my family would be safe, and Riley would be satisfied. There was only one problem: I had no idea how to do that. The things he spelled out weren't close to anything I was thinking or feeling. Sure, I'd been betrayed by my own kind. That hurt. I'd learned not to place my trust in them anymore. If I saw one of them again, I wouldn't hesitate to tell them what I thought of their betrayal and more. But I also knew that not all humans were like that. I'd met plenty of people who were willing to put their neck on the line to help someone else or myself. However, I'd never met a werewolf who thought of anyone but themselves. Even Samuel, who had been the kindest to me out of any of them, was forcing me to stay in this town with an additional punishment for running away. Everything he did was to gain my approval so he could have me as his own. Ask me about another one, Riley continued, oblivious to my concerns. I took a deep breath, pushing those thoughts out of my mind to focus on another flaw in Riley's plan. Won't the change kill me? It was a valid concern, one that I was more worried about than I let on. Not only was the change extremely long and painful, but not everyone survived. Additionally, some humans only made it halfway, becoming just part werewolf. On the surface, these creatures looked the same as any other human, but underneath their skin, their bodies were waging a constant, painful battle. Becoming this was almost worse than having the change kill you. These creatures, halflings as the wolves called them, were almost as low as humans on the totem pole. Then again, according to the wolves, if you weren't born a werewolf, then you were automatically inferior. Only the true-born wolves could lead a pack or be counted as anything more than extra space. That is a valid concern. I'm glad you voiced it, Riley mused, bringing his fingers to his chin. The change is risky for anyone, much more now than it used to be. But if you have a mate change you, it's much less of a risk. Anyone who shifts with a mate beside them is automatically stronger. My head was spinning. That wasn't the least bit reassuring. He was only saying that I probably wouldn't die. As for the last concern, whether or not he'll believe you actually want it, Riley started, not bothering to wait for me to ask. That is up to you. As Eden always told me, the first step in making someone believe a lie is to believe it yourself. My ears perked up at the unfamiliar name he used once again. I didn't dare ask him about it, knowing not to interrupt this lively mood of his. Instead, I tried another risky question, one I needed to know the answer to in order to even attempt success at his plan. My head was still bowed, and my voice grew small once more. How am I supposed to want to change into a werewolf? Riley looked at me with what could have been mistaken for pity. I knew it wasn't, only because it wasn't in his nature to show sympathy for someone like me. He sighed, suddenly tired and hesitant with his words. I'd ask Samuel about that one. What? I shook my head. That doesn't make any sense. Ask him and maybe it will. Although I'm honestly not sure he'll tell you, he shrugged. My eyes closed for a moment as I gained my composure. If he isn't going to tell me, then what am I supposed to do? I tried to keep my tone even despite my growing frustration. That sounds like a problem you've got to figure out. A doozy if you ask me, Riley flashed his teeth. But I'd suggest you figure it out quickly. I've talked to the doctors and you're being discharged tomorrow. You will finish your painfully slow healing process at home. I knew he wasn't talking about my home, but in that moment I had other things to focus on. Biting my lips, I tried desperately to hold back the vicious argument running through my head. There was no way I could do this. Riley was insane. Samuel would never believe me. He always knew when I was lying, even if it was something small. But I knew that despite my fear and trepidations, I didn't have a choice. If I couldn't pull this off, there was no chance Riley would be merciful. Riley cocked his head to the side as he looked at the time on his phone. He smiled, rolling his eyes slightly. I'd suggest you figure it out quickly, Samantha. He's back. Chapter 34, Something I Should Know. Riley held up his hand, quieting me, and trained his gaze on the door. His words slowly sunk in as I waited with him for Samuel's arrival. Barely a minute passed before Samuel flew into the room. His eyes darted to each corner, scanning over every piece of furniture and speck of dust. He was clearly winded, his hair was a mess, and his stance was ready to pounce. Riley laughed, looking at his phone. 25 minutes. I'm impressed, Sammy boy. Samuel finished his once-over of the room and glanced at me, relaxing slightly as he took the time to scan me over as well. When he was satisfied, Samuel looked away and pulled at his new shirt, adjusting his dark jacket. What can I say? I missed you, Riley, he joked, but his tone was distracted. Though I knew he didn't mean those words, I had to hold back a scoff. Both of their nonchalant attitudes were enough to infuriate me. Samuel must have noticed my reaction, for he suddenly sent me a wild grin, ignoring Riley's presence completely. Well, that's a good thing then, Riley sneered. I've got to talk to you about a few things. Since you've so wonderfully gone missing the past week, you've got a lot of catching up to do. It can wait. Samuel stared at me while he spoke, keeping that enthusiastic grin in place. We should be out of here in a couple days anyway. I'm sure you won't kill anyone until then. Riley sighed heavily, rising from the chair. He walked over to Samuel, placing a hand on his shoulder. It can't wait, and I can't promise anything. Samuel begrudgingly looked at Riley, lowering his voice. His smile faltered. What's going on? Riley nodded towards the door, turning Samuel to walk with him out into the hallway. However, Samuel refused and stayed rooted in place. They both whispered harshly for a second, Samuel gesturing towards me while they did. If Riley was aggravated by his defiance, he didn't show it, but instead let out another heavy sigh, rolling his eyes and half turning to face me. Such a heartthrob. He smirked suddenly as he shook his head and patted Samuel on the shoulder. Just remember, you're the one who said you wanted to wait. I'll be in the hall. With that last cryptic statement, Riley sauntered out of the room, closing the door behind him. When he was gone, Samuel groaned and ran a hand down his face before coming to sit heavily in his chair. Sorry about that. It's fine. I laughed once, immediate relief flowing through me at Riley's disappearance. Samuel raised an eyebrow, watching me curiously. How was Riley's company then? Fine, I repeated, though less chipper. My thoughts went back to the alpha for a moment. They clouded together as I remembered our conversation, dampening my mood once more. I hadn't even been given the chance to sort through a single thought before Samuel came back. Now I'd be expected to implement Riley's new plan, and I had no idea how. Even if I preferred Samuel over Riley, that didn't mean I was ready to spend forever with him and pretend to enjoy it. I needed time to figure this out. Your face tells me otherwise, Samuel smirked, reaching forward to grab one of my hands. He intertwined our fingers and began tracing my knuckles. I fought the instinct to pull my hand away. Ignoring his statement, I instead redirected his attention. Did you get everything taken care of? Samuel nodded and absently began running his other hand through his winded hair, putting the strands back into place. I watched him, my curiosity heightening, as I thought of what could have been important enough to cause him to leave, if only for a small amount of time. Luckily, Riley hadn't been too bad, but I would have preferred not to spend time with him at all. You can ask me, Samuel cut into my thoughts, bringing his hand back to his lap. Ask you what? The questions you want to know the answers to. It's okay to ask. I'll answer what I can. I bit my lip. If he knew everything that was running through my mind, he might not be so generous. I ultimately decided to keep the conversation safe, satisfying only my immediate curiosity. What did you go back for? He shrugged. I haven't lived in my apartment for months. I've been staying at the pack house with Riley. I rolled my eyes. That didn't answer my question. You're getting good at this, he laughed. I had a few things to put into storage. Plus, I might have left the place a disaster. What did you have to put in storage? Why was it a disaster? You sure are nosy today. He squeezed my hand gently. I shrugged but didn't relent or pull back my questions. You said I could ask. He shook his head, rolling his shoulders a few times. It was just some old belongings from when I was younger. When I came here I brought a lot of junk with me. And when I moved into that apartment I started sorting through everything. I gave up after a while and ended up spending most of my time back at the house. That's why it was a disaster. My interest peaked. Why did you go back? It was too quiet. Lonely sometimes. Oh, I breathed. Well, where were you before here? Up north. My eyes narrowed. That's vague. His face morphed into an unreadable expression. Because of this, I knew there would be more to the story than what he was about to tell me. There's not much to tell. I was up north, then I came here. I spoke before I could find my filter. Obviously there's more, you just don't want to tell me. He rolled his eyes and shifted his shoulders forward, tense. There's nothing more to it than what I just told you. What else would matter? Oh, I don't know. Maybe why you came here. Where you were up north. Who you were with. I didn't know why I was suddenly so interested in this part of Samuel, but I persisted with my newfound intrusiveness. If this conversation kept my mind off other matters, it was a success for me. He answered one of my questions. I needed Riley's help. That's why you came. Samuel nodded and I continued my interrogation. Why did you need his help? I bit my lip, knowing I was pushing him more than I should. With Riley in the building, probably lurking just outside the door, it wasn't hard to forget my presumed place. Samuel suddenly shut down, though he tried to hide it. His face became emotionless and his hand ceased the circles he'd been drawing around my knuckles. He helped me with a couple of things. Like what? I persisted, but Samuel gave me a hard look. I immediately retracted my question, continuing to another one, in hopes I could get different answers. Sorry. I kept my tone light, lifting up my free hand in surrender. How long have you been with Riley anyway? Since I was 12. So you came here when you were 12. Samuel nodded. My face scrunched as I thought through his words. Alone. I clarified and he nodded his head once more. I tilted my head to the side curiously. What about your family? He sighed heavily, his patience once again wearing. I didn't know why this subject was sore for him, but I ached to find the reason. This was the most I'd learned about Samuel ever. I've already told you the pack is my family. What about before the pack? Samuel pressed his lips together, letting thick silence stretch for a few minutes. It was soon clear he wasn't going to answer me. My curiosity still burned, but I knew I was drawing close to Samuel's limit with his patience. In any other situation I wouldn't worry about pushing him, but Riley was still fresh on my mind and walking the halls, waiting for Samuel to go outside and meet him. When the silence ultimately grew too tense and the idea of Riley listening in grew to be too much, I forced my pride back into the depths of my soul and uttered 3 painful syllables, trying to sound sincere. I'm sorry. Samuel was momentarily perplexed and the tense air lifted. For what? For being nosy. It's none of my business, I guess. He laughed. It was a loud barking sound, animalistic but innocent. Don't apologize for that. It's just not something I like to talk about is all. My face scrunched in confusion and intrigue. A sudden memory from my conversation with Riley came to the front of my mind, only causing the expression to deepen. He'd told me of something Samuel wouldn't talk to me about, and it was time to test that theory. Though I knew now probably wasn't the best time, and Samuel probably wasn't in the best of moods, I didn't know if I'd have another chance to talk like this with him. He was giving me some answers and I couldn't make it much worse. I worded my next question carefully, knowing it might be the only chance I had to not set Samuel's suspicions off, but to still get answers as well. Do you like being a werewolf? Samuel was beyond startled. What kind of a question is that? I'm just curious. I shrugged, trying to play it off, but desperately needing to know the answer. If Riley wasn't lying, Samuel's answer could solve one of my problems. Samuel countered my question, watching my face carefully. What exactly did you and Riley talk about? Nothing. I looked down, avoiding his gaze. The accusation in his voice told me he'd seen right through me. Right, he huffed, suddenly aggravated. And I'm to believe this sudden interest has nothing to do with him. Is this why you're asking all these questions? What did he tell you? I started to panic until Samuel's last question registered. Is there something I should know? Samuel clamped his mouth shut, shoulders tensing. My gaze was back on his, even when he broke away and scowled at the wall next to me. He closed his eyes. I just don't understand why you're asking these things. And I don't understand why you're not answering them. It was true. I was thoroughly confused. Suddenly, the Samuel I'd painted a picture of was beginning to morph. There were things he wasn't telling me, and not just things about the pack or Riley or what happened behind closed doors. These new things were pertaining to Samuel himself. I'd never cared to learn more about him before, but now that he was refusing to share his past or opinions with me, it was suddenly the very thing I craved most to learn. Samuel's scowl deepened. I took this time to fully study his features, staring deeply into his now opened eyes. Thankfully, they were his natural dark color with no hints of red. Red meant he was angry or out of control, and that's not what I needed. I could handle annoyed or frustrated, but I didn't want to deal with a wolf in my hospital room. As the silence stretched and the tension increased, I thought back to Riley's plan for Samuel and I. He'd laid out perfectly how I was supposed to think and act, and expected me to do so without flaw. It was impossible, unreasonable, infuriating. A large part of me suddenly wanted to deepen Samuel's scowl. This emerging feeling wanted to argue with Samuel, craved to tell him exactly what I thought of him, and ultimately send the wolf off the deep end without a second glance. I humored this new feeling for a fraction of a second, and I suddenly realized what exactly it was. Resentment. For Samuel. It was wrong. I knew that. If I should be feeling bitterness towards anyone, it should be Riley. While I did loathe the alpha and I dreaded each and every interaction with him, Samuel was the easiest target for my anger. He was the very reason Riley was coming after me in the first place. If it wasn't for him believing we had some sort of special bond, I would be halfway across the world working on getting my family there as well. But instead, I was stuck in a hospital with my family under the pressing thumb of a demented werewolf. Before I knew it, a slight scowl was forming on my face as well. It matched Samuel's, and I'm sure in that moment, we both looked beyond irritated. My body involuntarily tensed, my hands forming into small fists. Samuel still held one of them and noticed immediately. When he looked up to greet my eyes once more, his expression softened ever so slightly. "Don't be upset with me. I'm not," I practically seethed, though trying desperately to hold it back. I could resent Samuel, but I couldn't let him know it, because then Riley would know. But every emotion was too overwhelming to deal with, and I couldn't keep them all in check or under control. There was the sudden animosity for the person before me. There was the dread of the alpha werewolf prowling the halls. There was the bitter disappointment at being back in this godforsaken town. And finally there was the hot fury burning in the depths of my soul, ready to be let loose. Samuel sighed, leaning ever so slightly away from me, finally releasing my hand. "Look, maybe now is not the time to have this conversation. We're both tired, you're still on heavy medication, and we've been in this hospital for too long. I'm going to talk to the doctors and see if we can't get out of here sooner." Riley already talked to them, I told him, my voice as steel. He said we could leave tomorrow. Samuel nodded. "Then why don't we talk more then?" I let out a heavy breath, painfully forcing every emotion back into my chest and nodding my approval. This was not the time. This was not the place. There would never be a time or place. Samuel could never know what I truly thought or believed. He began to stand, his shoulders sagging and wrinkles making their way onto his forehead. When he turned away from my bed, it hit me how Riley was just waiting for an excuse to harm my family, and this would be the perfect opportunity. Samuel was annoyed and frustrated right after talking with me, and he was about to go see the alpha himself. Panicking, I shot my hand out to Samuel's. "Don't be upset." He stopped short, immediately turning back to face me. His eyes turned soft, glancing over my suddenly rigid frame. "I'm not. I didn't believe him. Please don't be upset." "I'm sorry. Don't be angry. I didn't mean to make you upset. I'm just tired and hurting, and I don't think—" Samuel cut off my rambling and shook his head softly, grabbing my hand and entwining our fingers. "I told you I'm not upset. See?" He flashed me a wide smile. I tilted my head to the side, sending him a hard and knowing look. He chuckled lightly, squeezing my hand for reassurance. "I've got to go talk to Riley. I promise I'm not upset. Just get some sleep and I'll be back soon, okay?" He let go of my fingers, not waiting for my response before he turned away and walked slowly out the door and into the hall. My heart was threatening to overtake my lungs as I watched him leave, my panic rising with each second. I could only pray he wasn't truly upset, or Riley wouldn't notice. Chapter 35. I promise. Sleep came surprisingly quickly. When it hit me, I didn't wake for anything. The first time I awoke was when the sun started creeping through the hospital room's window. The curtains were finally pulled back, allowing me a stunning view of the rooftop. Behind it, though, was the rising sun. It came gradually, allowing me to adjust to the new light. Then it hit the room all at once and refused to let me rest any longer. Samuel was sleeping soundly in the chair next to my bed. His head was resting on the edge of my mattress on top of his folded arms. He was leaning against my upper leg, though I could hardly feel him through the blankets that covered me. I assumed that my stirrings would cause him to wake immediately, but he stayed in a death-like trance. He didn't look peaceful in his sleep. His brow was furrowed and his lips were pulled into a small frown. His dark hair was scattered about his head, pieces falling forward and into his closed eyes. A small part of me wanted to push the hair from his face, but the larger part pushed me to shove him off my bed. I did neither of those things but instead took advantage of the rare opportunity of silence. This silence was almost comparable to being alone, something I hadn't had since the day I first left town. Without everyone breathing down my neck, it gave me a chance to sort through everything, even though I felt I'd done it 1,000 times. My mother always told me I was a worrier, and apparently that hadn't changed. Though there was nothing I could change or fix about the majority of my circumstances, that didn't stop my brain from constantly circulating with anxiety. Today was no exception. By the time the sun was fully streaming light into my hospital room, I'd thought everything through as much as possible. I'd figured out ways I could survive and push back feelings. I'd made a plan to follow in order to keep my family safe. Though there weren't many, I'd even allowed myself to think of the good things that could possibly come out of this. But despite all of this, I still worried. A soft knock on the door was what finally woke Samuel. It was one of the nurses, the blonde woman who seemed in charge of my care, that knocked and came into the room. At the sight of Samuel just barely waking, she tried to flee, but I quickly motioned her forward. If we were leaving this place today, there was no reason for Samuel to keep sleeping. I wanted to be gone as soon as possible. Pardon me, I was just checking up on Samantha. The woman spoke to Samuel first. Samuel nodded to the nurse, who immediately came to my side to jot things down on her clipboard. When she faced the equipment, Samuel sat up and leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his tired face. It was hard not to feel sorry for him in that moment. I'd been spending the last few days cuddled up in bed while Samuel forced himself into a chair too small for him. Is it true they're letting me go today? I turned to the nurse, speaking quietly and allowing Samuel a moment to wake up. She jumped slightly at my voice but tried to mask it. I believe that is still the plan, yes. We will have to remove your stitches and talk about your continued care. But afterward, you will be fine to leave. I smiled, thankful I wouldn't be spending another night here. Though I knew the next day would be exhausting and only result in me sleeping in yet another foreign bed, it would be worth it to finally leave the doctors and medicines. Samuel suddenly spoke. I'll call for you when we're ready for all that. The woman finished her writing, turning to face Samuel. She nodded and bowed her head, taking his sentence as a request to leave. Why aren't we ready now? When the nurse was gone, I looked at Samuel curiously. It was then I realized the bags and crow's feet accentuating his eyes. Before I could stop myself, I commented, "You look horrible." He laughed stiffly. "Thanks. How late were you out with Riley?" Samuel shook his head, leaning forward once more. He placed both elbows on top of my mattress, close to my leg but not quite touching. Most of the night. I nodded, knowing he wouldn't elaborate even if I asked. I didn't expect him to anymore. How are you feeling? I smirked, smoothing out the blanket in my lap. Probably better than you. Samuel smiled tightly and rolled his eyes, but he never responded. I found this odd, as he would normally counter my sarcastic comments and goad me further. It seemed this morning was not the case. Are you all right? I turned my head to face him, biting my lip. Fine, he grunted, voice strained. You sure? I started. You seem a little. I'm fine, he clipped. I shook my head ever so slightly, trying not to furrow my eyebrows. The last time Samuel was this short with me was when I'd done something to piss him off. Unless he was upset about last night, I wasn't sure what I'd done to cause this reaction from him. Samuel suddenly groaned, running a hand down his face once more. His movements set me on edge, as I noticed the stress running tightly through his limbs. However, I didn't make the mistake of voicing my concern again. Instead, I looked for a way to lighten the mood. I was intent on getting out of here today, and I wasn't going to let his actions prevent that. Do you want some water or something? I gestured to the cup sitting on the table hovering next to my bed. His eyes were closed, head resting on his hands, but he smiled ever so lightly at my question. I'm fine. You should drink. I shrugged. Not really thirsty. Samuel sighed heavily, opening his eyes to meet my watchful ones. They were dark and pained, and I immediately knew something was wrong. His actions were starting to make sense. The short tone, the exhaustion, his stress, all of this led to me believing something happened last night, something that was less than favorable. Keeping eye contact, I asked him once more. What's wrong? He searched my face for an answer, knowing I couldn't give him one. A tense and silent moment passed before he finally spoke. You're going to hate me. I was alarmed to say the least. What are you talking about? Samuel broke my gaze, looking at his hands resting next to my leg. He fidgeted as he responded. There's something I need to tell you and you're not going to like it. What is it? My heart rate was slowly climbing. Samuel sighed heavily. There was a pause as he looked into my eyes, the stress etched into his features only increasing. You can't freak out. My eyes went wide. What do you mean I can't freak out? Please just tell me what's going on. He shook his head. Before I tell you, you have to promise to stay calm and listen to everything. I don't want the doctors asking me questions and I don't want to sedate you again. His voice, though still stressed, held a bit more force. I nodded at his request, knowing he wouldn't tell me anything otherwise. Whatever Samuel wanted to tell me wasn't going to be good, and only that much I knew. No matter how much his cryptic words sent my mind racing, I couldn't figure out what had him so on edge. However, thoughts of my family, bloodied and dismembered like in my dreams, flashed through my mind. That would be enough to make me freak out. He watched me carefully for a moment, making sure I would keep true to my word. I kept my face calm and composed as I awaited his words like they were the last I would ever hear. Something happened, and we're not sure how. Samuel eventually spoke agonizingly slow. I was going to surprise you later today. I was going to have your mother come to the hospital. He went silent, his eyes trained on mine. When he didn't continue, I pushed him on. And Samuel's lips thinned. I've been having a few people keep an eye on her. I knew you would be worried and I didn't like not knowing where James was. I didn't want you to worry about her. He paused, making sure I was still with him. The guys I had watching her last night were supposed to tell her and bring her up here to meet you this morning. My heart dropped. Realization hit me like a wave crashing on a rocky shore, tearing each and every loose bit of stone apart. He continued, shaking his head. I don't know what happened, Samantha. There were multiple people watching the house. He trailed off, searching for an explanation. He rambled on a few more sentences, telling me things I didn't want to hear. While he did, my world crashed around me. What are you saying? I abruptly cut him off. Samuel looked at me in pain. Your mother's gone. I was suddenly unable to breathe, talk, or think. A cold silence filled the room, sending daggers piercing into my body. Samuel didn't speak. He only watched me with an unreadable expression. Even he knew there was no point in speaking. There was nothing that could be uttered that would be able to fix the words that just left his mouth. What do you mean? I suddenly cried out, cutting through the stillness as the panic found a permanent home in my heart. Samuel reached forward to grip my hands. I flinched back involuntarily, and additional pain flashed through his features. His hands were left extended by my side, reaching out for something he knew he could never have. When he spoke, his voice was low and defeated. Peyton and a few others went to her house. When he knocked on the door, she didn't answer. He went inside and found the place abandoned. Tears were stinging my eyes. She left. He shook his head fervently. No, of course not. There was a struggle. The house was a mess. She didn't go willingly. A struggle. I repeated. We had a few trackers scope the place out and they've been searching the territory all night. There weren't any unfamiliar scents, though. They don't have anything to go off of. It's like she disappeared. Disappeared. I took a deep and shaky breath, my voice trailing off on his last word. I'm so sorry, Samantha. Samuel hung his head. I don't know how it happened. I had people watching her. There was no way anyone could have gotten to her. My mind was racing. The first of many tears slipped down my cheeks, and I saw Samuel reach out to catch them. However, he retracted his hand as soon as the thought crossed his mind and folded his hands in his lap instead. "Please say something," Samuel begged. I was breathing heavily, 1,000 different thoughts running through my mind. I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell. I wanted to push Samuel and everyone else as far away from me as possible. No, Samantha, you're lying. My brain looked for a reasonable explanation. Possible he looked even more hurt than before. I wouldn't lie about this. I shook my head, hysteria slowly creeping in. What he was saying couldn't be true. It couldn't. If it were, that would mean she was gone without a trace or clue as to where to find her. Tears were waterfalling down my face now, and my chest was so tight I doubted if I would ever be able to breathe again. "You have to be." I suddenly cried out, my voice much louder than before. Samuel's head snapped up. "Samantha, please. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I demanded, scooting to the edge of the bed. "You needed more rest. If I woke you up and told you, it would have been much worse." I shook my head, clutching my heart. "I have to find her. I have to—" Samuel cut me off, gripping my wrist as I tried to slip off the bed. I pulled against him, attempting to swing my legs onto the floor. He anticipated this though and gripped my knee. "You're not going anywhere." I pulled harder against his grip. "How can you say that? I have to find her. I have people looking for her right now. It's not going to do you or her any good if you go running through the woods again. You're still not even fully healed." "I'm fine," I bit out, letting myself fall back into the bed. Fighting against his grip was useless. "But she's not. I have to do something. Let me go." He shook his head, his grip never easing. "You can't leave. But if you calm down, then we can talk this through." "What is there to talk about?" I cried, voice raising once more. Samuel closed his eyes. Though his face told me he was angry, I knew that there was more to it than that. He was hurting too. For what reason I didn't know and didn't care. "What do you know about your stepfather?" My eyes widened, recognition of his insinuation doing nothing to calm my nerves. "James," I breathed, my gaze snapping to Samuel's. He nodded. "It's the best we have to go on. We've had people following his scent all night, but they can't find anything." My voice broke as I croaked out, "It has to be him." "That's what I think too. Now what do you know about him? When did he and your mother meet? Is he from this territory?" His questions went in one ear and out the other. I had no answers. I knew nothing about James apart from the fact that he was the man who made my life miserable. I never cared to know. Now it seemed that was coming back to haunt me. James could have taken my mother anywhere. Tears continued to flow. I curled my legs into my chest and wrapped my arms around them. I felt the pull of my stitches, but I didn't care. In that moment I felt a different kind of pain. One that I wasn't used to, nor did I know how to deal with it. "We'll find her, Samantha." Samuel cut through the pain for a moment, dangling hope on a string. "I promise we'll find her. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend."